Hello there and welcome. In this video I'm going to be talking about braking. Now naturally braking is a safety critical part of the operation of riding a motorcycle, so it's very important we get it right. So if in doubt, always consult a qualified instructor for some live training. And in this video I'm going to give you some basics in the same way that you'll receive on your CBT, and then we'll go on further to look at things in a little bit more detail. So whilst CBT is very helpful initially, it doesn't go far enough for someone that wants to be serious about riding a motorcycle. So as I'm sure most of you will know, motorcycles have two brakes. The front brake, which is operated by the lever here on the right handlebar, and the rear brake, which is operated by the foot pedal, normally on the right hand side here. Automatic motorcycles may have their rear brake located on the left handlebar in the same way as a pedal cycle, but on a manual motorcycle this is your clutch lever. So with most motorcycles then, the brake lever here operates the front brake and the foot pedal here operates the rear brake. But on some motorcycles we have a system called linked braking. It's normally found on the larger motorcycles, and in fact this motorcycle also has a linked braking system. And what that means is that when I apply the front brake, I get a percentage of rear brake come into play as well. And when I press the rear brake pedal, I get a tiny percentage of front brake come in at the same time. There is also a system called a semi-linked braking system, which means when you apply the front brake operates and a percentage of the rear, but when you press the rear brake pedal, only the rear brake works. And that's the system on my BMW R1200RT. And I like that system because it means that when you're doing slow speed control manoeuvres, you exclusively use that rear brake. Some motorcycles now are fitted with safety aids linked to the braking system. The most common being anti-lock braking system, or ABS. And what ABS does is it senses if the wheel is about to lock on the road, and it will release the brakes and reapply them very rapidly so that the wheel keeps turning. And if the wheel keeps turning, you've got much less chance of going into a skid situation, which causes a dangerous loss of control. With motorcycles with standard brakes without ABS, you have to be aware of that situation yourself. Some motorcycles, like this one yet again, have very complex systems. They have got a cornering braking system. So the motorcycle is reading the speeds, it's sensing the feedback from the wheels via the brake sensors, and it's also thinking about the lean angle. And it's doing a lot of work for you if you get things wrong. As a new rider, it's vitally important you know exactly what systems are fitted to your machine, or not, but it's also vitally important that you always ride the machine as if it hasn't got any assistance at all. Because you need to hone your skills from the word go, and you need to make sure you have a real good understanding of braking and how to apply that in practice. And then if these safety aids come into play, they're telling you didn't get it right, they're giving you a little warning, but they've saved you. It's also worth bearing in mind that none of these safety aids can completely defy the laws of physics and cannot prevent an accident in all circumstances. So it is up to you as a rider to take responsibility to operate your motorcycle well and correctly. So the front brake is your most powerful brake. It's by far the strongest of the two. We often talk about figures such as 75% braking force at the front and 25% at the rear. We don't need to get too hung up on those figures, but they're fairly accurate. The front brake is far more powerful than the rear. One of the reasons for that is that when we brake or decelerate, the weight of us and the machine goes forward and down. So it goes down the forks and the tyre compresses, gives us a little bit more rubber on the road, and because of that weight transference down onto the road, the front brake is particularly effective. But that action means that the rear end rises, which means that the rear tyre has less grip on the road, therefore the rear brake is not going to be so effective. When we're on a road surface that is a bit wet, a bit slippery, we need to be a little bit more gentle with that front brake. And when we think about the 75-25-ish% braking force, that's not the amount you use the lever or pedal, by the way, that's the amount of force that the braking is giving you. we need to try and even that out a little bit more 50-50. So braking distances will be longer on loose or wet slippery surfaces. As a general rule, the front brake is used just a fraction before the rear. So we would apply the front brake and then the rear brake. So front, back, front, back. That's not rigid guidance, but it is the norm and it's what you'll be taught on your CBT initially. There may be circumstances which cause you to vary the way that you operate your brakes in conjunction with one another. But that's the best advice we can give you initially, is to use the front just a fraction before the rear and then use the two together. There are times when it is advisable not to use the front brake at all. As a new rider, whilst cornering, you shouldn't be using the front brake at all. Using the front brake should be done whilst upright and in a straight line, and on very loose surfaces, especially if there's any cornering involved, the front brake should not be used. Okay, so let's now look at the way we use the controls themselves. So the first thing about using brakes is we must always be smooth and we must always be progressive. We must never be harsh or aggressive in the way that we brake. So with the front brake lever, it's long enough for 4 fingers, so we should use all 4 fingers for road riding. What I will often do is I will often start applying the brake with my little finger and then work my fingers up the lever to apply pressure. So when we first start to brake, the first thing that we do is to close the throttle. That can be braking in its own right, engine braking. The fingers can then touch the brake lever and then we can gently start to apply braking pressure. And the more speed we need to lose, the more firmly we can squeeze the lever. A lot of this takes time and practice to get right, but it also depends on the motorcycle you're riding. So it's good to practice in a safe environment. That's why the CBT exists, of course. Having got rid of the unwanted speed, we can then start to ease the pressure on the brake lever. What we must not do is grab and let it fly out like that. All of the way we use this brake is very controlled, very considered. You need to learn to do this right from the word go, because you need to build positive muscle memory at doing things the right way. That way you'll find progression onto direct access test training or even advanced training a lot easier. It's much easier for us to learn to do things properly the first time rather than to start trying to undo bad habits that we've achieved. So when we apply the brakes, just to reaffirm, we close the throttle, we gently start to apply the front brake, and we'll also gently start to apply the rear brake. As that speed is coming off, we're easing the pressure on the front brake, but if we want to come to a complete stop, we will stay with the rear brake. So the last few meters, if you like, of the stop will generally be done mainly on the rear brake. The reason for that is we don't want all the weight at the front of the motorcycle when we're travelling at very low speeds and we're just about to stop. We want to level the motorcycle out more to make it more comfortable. And it also makes it safer, because if the road is slippery at very low speeds, we don't want that front end under lots of braking with lots of weight going through that front tyre. So one other thing we need to be careful of when we're using the front brake. I used to do this years ago. It's not helpful. I used to ride around with my fingers touching the brake lever all the time, because I'd been told if something suddenly happens, you're straight on the brake. That is potentially unsafe. The reason being, we're riding along with the throttle open. Now, first of all, I haven't got very good throttle control if my fingers are outstretched. Much more control if they're around the throttle. However, I've got the power on, I'm riding around, something happens, I bring the brake on. I haven't closed the throttle. Closing the throttle is my first brake, always. That means I've got a lot of power at the back wheel pushing the motorcycle forward, but a front wheel that's saying stop. That can potentially cause a severe loss of control of the motorcycle, quite apart from the fact the motorcycle isn't going to slow down nearly as quick as you want it to. So the procedure has to be throttle off, touch the brake lever, use if necessary. There is absolutely no problem with closing the throttle and touching the brake lever once the throttle is closed in anticipation of braking, even if you don't need to. I know that some motorcyclists do that almost as a default. Close the throttle, touch the brake, don't need it, back on the throttle, away we go. Or close the throttle, touch the brake, use it, lose it, and away we go. So the phrase use it, lose it may be used on your CBT or direct access training by some instructors. It's a little memory there for you to get your fingers away from the brake lever once you've done what you need to do. So going on from that, if we read the road well in advance and anticipate problems, we're already shortening our stopping distances if they're necessary. So our stopping distances are made up of our thinking distance and our actual braking distance. Now the thinking distance will depend on how alert you are, whether you expect and anticipate the problem, or whether it appears suddenly, which in all fairness it doesn't normally happen on the road. It's inattention that makes things seem like they're sudden. And the thinking distance is composed of the time it takes you to react and get that brake to first start coming on. When we look at the braking distance itself, that's the distance it takes for that brake to take effect and to lose speed. And that's dependent on many factors. How effective you are in using your brakes to their maximum, safely, the temperature of the tyre, the temperature of the road, the condition of the road, whether you are able to brake firmly because you've got a vehicle so close behind you maybe. There's a lot of things you need to consider. So when we see the stopping distances listed in the highway code, they are really guides. There are many, many factors that will affect how soon or not that you can stop. And generally speaking, cars will stop quicker than a motorcycle because they've got 4 large lumps of rubber in each corner. You've got 2. And we're now going to talk about the tyres because they have massive implications on your braking. So you can have the best brakes fitted, the best discs, the best pads in the world. But if your tyres are poor, not up to the job, or the road conditions just aren't good, your braking will never be as effective as you like. So we have what's called a contact patch on each tyre. That is where the tyre touches the road, and it's approximately the size of the palm of your hand. So everything that you do on the motorcycle with your controls transfers to that contact patch. There's always a finite amount of grip to be used for the act of braking, accelerating or cornering. And we have to be aware of a thing called the tyre grip trade-off. So in other words, when the motorcycle is upright and travelling in a straight line, we have the maximum amount of tyre grip available for the act of braking or acceleration. As the motorcycle starts to lean, that tyre grip is used up by the act of cornering. And the further it leans, the more of the grip it uses. Therefore, the further the bike leans, the less grip we have available for acceleration or braking. So problems come when somebody leans their motorcycle over and then uses a lot of brake or a lot of acceleration. And what happens there is the tyre will say, no, there's not enough grip, can't hang on any longer, and the bike will slide out from under you. So you've got to be very aware of that. And that's why as a new rider, we say to you, only use the front brake whilst upright and travelling in a straight line. Now we know there are circumstances where you need to brake whilst cornering. It may be the road is designed that way. You've come round a bend and there's a junction and you have to stop, or there's an obstruction. The key here is to brake firmly on the straight and brake gently in the curve. And if you need to brake in the curve, you will generally, as a new rider, favour the rear brake. As you become more experienced and more at one with your motorcycle, if you are using your controls smoothly and progressively as you should be, there is room to use some front brake whilst cornering, but it must be very gentle, it must be very progressive, As a new rider, this is an area that you must be very cautious of. Okay, so now what we'll do is we'll look at some practical applications of braking, both here on the training area and out on the road. So we can see in this video clip here how we're using the front brake far too harshly and aggressively, and it's creating quite a lot of upset to the balance of the bike. You can see that front end bouncing down and then coming back upright at the last moment. And you can see in this clip here how, as we don't use the brakes quite effectively, we wobble slightly, lose our balance and put the incorrect foot down, leading to us losing the rear brake. In this clip here, we're very aggressive, both feet come out and we lose our balance. Here we only use the back brake to stop. We use far too much pressure, the ABS kicks in and it takes ages to stop. If we didn't have ABS, that would have resulted in a skid. So now in these clips we're going to be using the brakes much more effectively. Front brake first, rear brake afterwards, and easing that front brake off towards the end. So you can see that weight transferring to the front, but it's a lot smoother and it's a lot more under control. In these final two clips we're going to use the rear brake only because we're travelling at very low speeds, and we don't need to use the front brake when we're travelling at low speeds, approximately walking pace or thereabouts. Use of the front brake is unnecessary. We don't need that amount of braking force. So the golden rule for getting the speed correct is you must always travel at a speed so that you can stop safely in the distance that you can see to be clear. Now that is an unbreakable rule. If you're so fast you can't stop in the distance you can see to be clear, you're putting yourself at risk of colliding with something. So the other rule we use a lot in driving and riding is the 2-second rule. That gives us a good stopping distance from the vehicle in front. So when the vehicle in front passes any fixed object, it could be a shadow, telegraph pole, road marking, we count off 2 seconds, and you can say, only a fool breaks the 2-second rule. We should not pass that same fixed object in the time of 2 seconds. If we do, we're travelling too close to the vehicle in front. Now on wet road surfaces, that 2 seconds should be doubled to 4. And we know that the highway code advises that in snowy and icy conditions, stopping distances can increase by up to 10 times. So when you're riding around, whilst you do need to be looking well up the road, you need the eyes to be searching regularly. And part of your scanning that you do is assessing the road surface ahead of you. You should never put your motorcycle anywhere that you haven't checked out is safe first. And part of the reason for assessing the road surface is so that if you need to brake, you're getting a good idea of what sort of braking you can do. So this road surface is quite reasonable at the moment. It's dry. Braking on metalwork when it's wet, such as these drain covers, would be hazardous. If there's a loose road surface such as gravel or potholes, then braking on that surface could be hazardous. So you have to tailor your braking according to the surface that you're travelling on, because what we do not want is a skid. Now a skid is a loss of control, and very often when asked what causes a skid, many people will say, oh, the road conditions, oh, the rain caused a skid. It didn't. It was the operator, the rider, that caused the skid. Skidding is caused by inappropriate braking, steering or acceleration. And as we're talking about braking, we can induce a skid very easily if we are far too heavy, harsh and aggressive with our brakes. The most likely wheel to skid on a motorcycle is the rear, because as we've already said, it becomes very light under braking because the weight transfers to the front. But of the two skids, a front wheel or a rear wheel skid, a rear wheel skid is more controllable. The back end will normally travel in a straight line for a short while, but it may then start to step out a little bit. If it steps out too much, you're in trouble. If you go into a skid, you need to immediately remove the cause. So if you become aware that one of your tyres has started to skid, remove the brake and reapply it more gently. Now that requires great presence of mind and experience. This is where motorcycles with anti-lock braking systems are so great, because they're doing that job for you. So we're just going to look at some braking now out on the road. Now at this junction at the end, I'm going to turn right. So my first brake is to close the throttle. My hand touches the brake lever, my foot touches the brake pedal. I gently apply the brake lever, closely followed by application of the brake pedal. As I come toward the junction, I just ease off the pressure on the front brake lever, but stay with the brake pedal. My fingers come back onto the throttle so that I'm ready to move away. I ease off of the back brake and let the motorcycle move. And once I've done that, I move my foot clear of the rear brake pedal. So with this junction here, having checked my mirrors, I close the throttle as my first brake, touch both my brakes and use them together, the front brake a fraction before the rear. Now with time and practice, you'll get really good at it. But the key to remember is to be smooth and progressive. Okay, so we're leaving the dual carriageway here. I'm changing my speed a little bit by use of the throttle. It's what we call acceleration sense. But I don't want to lose speed on the main carriageway unless I need to. And at the moment I'm just regulating my speed purely with the throttle. So you can see we have a roundabout ahead. So I'm planning braking already, and we've got a change in limit to 40. So checking behind, closing the throttle as the first brake. The speed is reacting naturally. Now I'm gradually coming down the gears as my speed drops. I'm covering the brakes because he's slowed down a lot. So I'm anticipating that the traffic lights might change. They have. Closing the throttle, early brake light, because that van behind looked a little bit keen earlier, so I'm on both brakes. The front's been used a fraction before the rear. Gradually coming down the gears with the clutch in, easing off the front brake and stopping finally on the rear brake. So as we approach the roundabout, then off the throttle, front brake, back brake together, gears, speed's correct, leave the brakes and we ride on. Same with this roundabout, mirrors, close the throttle, traffic cue, front brake, back brake together, easing off the brakes as the speed becomes correct, making sure that the gear is correct for our road speed, and then we'll turn right at the mini roundabout, mirrors. So my speed's good, I don't need any brakes. So we're going to turn right here, both brakes together, getting our speed correct, getting our gears correct, off the brake, gently into the turn. So one big error for turning into junctions, people don't get enough speed off and then they're struggling to get round the turn. If you take your time, pace yourself, it'll all be nice and under control. Just like here, we get the speed correct, and for the next junction, get the speed correct. In fact, didn't need the brakes for that at all, because I use what we call acceleration sense, just using the throttle in conjunction with the correct gear to achieve the speed I want. So you can see there's a right hand bend 90 degree at the end of the road. Now sometimes I could just roll off the throttle to get the speed correct, but if I use the brakes, I will use the brakes to get the speed correct, get my gear set on the straight, leave the brakes alone, and then I can just gently come back on the gas to come through the bend. So you're just making sure you set yourself up for everything in plenty of good time. We know that new riders don't look far enough up the road, which means things seem to happen very quickly for them. Well, things aren't happening very, very quickly. They're happening the same speed for everyone else. It's just that they're not looking far enough up the road, so they haven't bought themselves enough time to deal with the problems. So one of the other issues I see with a lot of new riders is they fear that as they slow down and use the brakes, the motorcycle is going to fall over. So they're very keen to get their foot on the tarmac. We don't need to rush and panic about bringing our feet down. Now, generally speaking, we should only put one foot down, and that is normally the left foot, because you want the rear foot up for the brake. So like here, for example, I'm going to come to a gradual stop. I'm gently going to put my foot out, touch the tarmac once with it, and I'm under perfect control and balance. I don't need to thrust my foot out, upset the balance of the bike and panic. We sometimes see people going along with their foot touching the floor 3 or 4 times like they're skateboarding. We don't want that. And I appreciate that may be a confidence thing, but get used to the bike slowing down and you will feel that it's still fairly stable. You know, it's not suddenly going to topple over on you. So like at this junction here, let's turn right, so I'm going to use both brakes. Notice how this has got a curve on it. So as I come into the curve, I'm going to ease the front brake and stay with the back brake. Okay, so it's really good that you practice using both of these brakes together, with the front just coming in a fraction before the rear. But when we're travelling at very, very low speeds or on very rough, slippery surfaces, we only need to use the rear brake. So like at this junction here, I'm really slow. All I need to do is use the rear. I don't need the front at all. I've already lost my road speed through natural engine braking, and that's by slowing down at the gear I was already in and then changing the gear as the road speed drops. I don't change gear to lose road speed. Essentially, gears are for going, brakes are for slowing, is the old saying. And using the gearbox to slow a motorcycle down is a technique that we can explain another day. But basically, if I want to slow down here, for example, I close the throttle. That slows me down. That's engine braking. As the revs fall and the speed falls, I then choose the next lower gear. And so the motorcycle slows even more, so I chose the next lower gear. So I haven't used the gears to slow the motorcycle. I've just matched the gears to the speed of the motorcycle using engine braking. What we don't want is this sort of thing. That is using the gearbox to slow the motorcycle, and it's not the best technique to use. One of our greatest assets at speed control, though, is fine use of the throttle. That acceleration sense that allows us to accelerate and then just roll off the throttle without any use of the brakes at all to achieve the correct speed that we desire is important. Now here I've got to brake a little bit just to get the gap correct. And the bend at the end of the road looks fairly sharp, so I'm going to be a little bit careful with the throttle. I'm planning using the brakes, but as it happens, the acceleration sense by using the throttle means I haven't had to brake at all. I'm still travelling at a speed so that I can stop in the distance that I can see to be clear. Now on single track roads you have to increase that distance because you have to allow for the braking distance of an oncoming unseen vehicle. So here I'm going to slow it right down. Still haven't actually touched the brakes though, all on acceleration sense. But if I needed the brakes, I know I've got them. It's like here. Quite a awkward little junction that. It's uphill, it comes back through a curve. All I've done is I've just used the rear brake. Didn't really want to use the front at all. Okay, so we're on a dual carriageway road at the moment doing 70. We're taking the next slip road off, so I can carry my speed onto the slip road. I'm going to be taking the next turning left. I don't know if you can see a car braking there ahead. So I'm going to close the throttle to start reducing speed, but I've got to get rid of a lot more speed to take the left turn. So it's on the brakes, bit of firm braking if necessary, coming down those gears, and we can see that we soon get the speed to a very comfortable speed, and then we just gently put the bike around the corner. Now at the end of the road here we're turning left, and this road curves left, so this involves braking on a bend. So I'm going to get rid of the speed with both brakes, getting the gears correct, easing off the front brake, staying with the rear brake. Now if I need to stop, I can. I don't need to, as it happens. So I just leave the rear brake and off we go. Okay, so we're coming to the end of our video on braking. We can't cover everything on a video such as this, and as I always say, there's no substitute for training live with a qualified instructor. And there's many braking techniques at advanced level which we haven't gone into on this video. But I hope it's been useful, and if you're about to start your training, or you're between CVT and direct access training, hopefully you've gained something from it. Keep up the practicing, keep up the good work, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, ride safe and take care.